Okay, well, if you're here to see Chris O'Donnell, that was last hour, so sorry about that. We had a schedule mix-up. He has a flight he's going to catch. So I'm here to talk a little bit about config entities. And who am I? My name is Jeremiah Davis. I'm a solutions architect at Horizontal Integration. You can find me as jerdavis on Drupal.org. I'm a organizer of the camp since we started it back in 2011. I help organize the local user group, and I've been working with Drupal for over 11 years now. So, Drupal 8, back in DrupalCon Chicago in 2011, they started talking about the configuration management initiative. And what this was is like trying to separate out configuration from content. Because back in Drupal 5, 6, 7, there was a really blurry, if non-existent line of what was configuration that actually like drove your site, and what was the content of the site. It was just all in the database. There weren't really some solid lines. So that made things like deployments very difficult. You had to use things like features to try to capture configuration. It was all very not fun. Now with Drupal 8, we've got the awesome configuration management system. We can export our configuration to our file system. We can deploy it across environments. And it's a much nicer world. And I had another slide on that. So, configuration management, it separates our configuration from our content. It draws a nice hard line and lets you as a module developer say that these things are configuration and then these things are content. And configuration can be synced. It can be exported from the database into YAML files on your file system. Those files are treated as code, so they can be part of your code repository. You can check them in and you can version them and you can deploy them across environments. If you have errors, you can go back in your history, you can recover, and you can redeploy. So configuration entities are a new part of this concept. So like other entities, they are things where you can define structured data. You can create a configuration entity type. You can add fields to it. You can define whatever metadata you need to capture the things that you want to capture. And just like your regular configuration for your site in Drupal 8, these things can be exported, and they can be managed, and they can be deployed. So we've had a couple of use cases that I've come across that I wanted to talk about. So before deciding how these things are done, the basic use case was we wanted to manage a library of code snippets. So content editors should be able to add custom JavaScript or CSS snippets to pages. A little scary. Developers should be the ones with the permissions to define what those things are. So content editors aren't just going and copying and pasting code from random websites and putting it into a body or something. There should be a developer that is working to integrate some application for a specific page. They want to be able to use JavaScript or CSS, and they want to be able to build the library that the content editors can then use. And the custom snippets should be scoped to the page they're on. They shouldn't just be added to the site at large. These are like one-off pages with like a form integration or something, not something you're adding across your entire site. So you don't want that JS loaded on every page. You want it just where you want it. So this had led me down the path of creating a module called JSnippets. And I developed this as a sort of custom module for a client project, and then I abstracted it and have contributed it back. So this is on Drupal.org. You can check it out. You can use it if you want to, or you can just look at it as an example of what some of the possibilities are. So the module defines a configuration entity for managing the snippets that allows developers to build our library. It allows snippets to be referenced on a content entity. So using just an entity reference field, we can include those snippets on any content entity, whether it's a node, a paragraph, a block, or a custom content entity that you created for your project. One of the interesting things the module does is it then writes those snippets to the file system and dynamically builds library definitions for Drupal. So rather than just taking the JavaScript snippet that you paste into the configuration and then like writing a script tag onto the page through a field formatter or something, we're actually writing out JS and CSS files to the file system and then iterating over any of the snippet configuration entities and building out a library definition so that they can be attached to render arrays and added to the page, sort of using best practice methods. And that is accomplished in part through a custom field formatter, an extension to entity reference, that when the field is rendered, it can go and add those library definitions, attach them to that array, and that's how they get loaded into the page. So here you can see a screenshot. Yep, oops, fairly readable. This is an example of the configuration form for one of these snippets. So we've got just a name, which is also tied to a machine name that gets generated. That's one of the field types available. We've got a drop down for what type of snippet you're adding, JavaScript or CSS. We've got a little text area where you can paste in your code, and that could be a full JavaScript application, or in this case, it's a reference to an external library. And this will get added as an external library to our library definition. Not sure why the Drupal behavior checkbox is checked on this example, but it is. So in the case of adding just a block of JavaScript, you can check a box and it will wrap that in a Drupal behavior, so things like Ajax, page refreshes, and stuff behave properly. And in the case of JavaScript, you can choose scope. So if you really have to have this in the head for whatever reason, you can scope it to head. It defaults to footer, so it will scope things to the footer. And that's just where in your page structure those things will appear. Here's another screenshot. This one shows an example of just a blob of JavaScript. This one is on the site that it's on. It's basically creating this block or hiding this block. So they wanted to have a disclaimer that you have to read. Through the disclaimer, you click a button, and then it unhides the content so that you can then see it. And that's the kind of thing that, like, at least for this client, you didn't want to have to go through the process of like creating a bunch of structure in your code base to accomplish this. It was just some JavaScript for one page for one specific application. So this was a solution that worked for them. So here we can see this is the content editing form for this page. And you can see where we've provided a component that is a snippet. We added some extra stuff to this, like a container ID that will get written out to, this is using paragraphs. So for that paragraph type, it'll write a container ID to the container so you can target it for stuff that the JavaScript is doing. And then we have a multi-value field for our snippets. That's just an entity reference. And you can add as many as you need. And here you can sort of see part of what it's doing. So that JavaScript was making it so that this content appeared and you had to click that button in order to unhide it. And then kind of getting back to what I was saying in the beginning about generating the library definitions and using the attach behavior to get the content or the JavaScript or CSS onto the page. You can see here the middle line is our JavaScript file coming from the snippets directory. And it's got a cache breaking tag on the end to make sure that it doesn't get cached. I've also special cased the JavaScript and CSS for this module so that it doesn't get aggregated. So that way it doesn't end up in the compile.js and populate across the site. It will just only load on this page. So in this case, for this client, some of the takeaways. Snippets can be created on a local development environment. They can be tested by your developers, and then they can be deployed out because you can export them. When snippet configuration is imported, the files I was talking about are generated automatically and available as libraries. Snippets can also be created or modified in production through the UI with appropriate permissions. So we've given the developers, in this case, the ability to create these things in production. So if they have to get some JS and CSS on a custom page right away, they can do it without going through an entire release cycle. Snippets are attached through the rendered entity reference field and are scoped just to that page. Multiple snippets can be added to a page. In the example I had shown, there was one JS file, and there's also a CSS file and another snippet that was doing some styling. You can also use that to, for example, include an external a JavaScript library from something like an Ansible form or something. Include your own JavaScript snippet to configure what you need to configure for that form and your own CSS to style it. Caveats. So this does come with a little bit of extra stuff. So in our case, we're allowing the snippets to be edited or created in production. So that adds a little bit of complexity for releases. When we're doing a release to production, we need to make sure that we pull configuration back down from production, export it, check for changes, and merge those back into our development stream so that they don't get stomped on when we do our release. So our second use case is managing a library of styles. So for this site, we have a set of components that we've created as paragraphs. We have things like an RTE component. We've got a CTA component. And in the design documents for the site, in the design spec for the site, those components had variations. So on one page, your CTA might have a blue background. On another page, it might have a gray background and a different styling for the link. And we didn't want to create a lot of one-off complexity for that or recreate components just to have those variations. We wanted to have a flexible system of styles, a flexible library that content editors could pick a style for a component. And developers could create that library and get it out to their content editors. So when we first started talking about this, we're like, well, taxonomy. We can just create a styles vocabulary. We can add terms to it. Those can have classes. Done. And the problem with that is you can't test that. You can't easily do that locally and then deploy it because that's content. So if you're going to build it in a taxonomy, then you're going out directly to your development environment. Or if you're already in production, you're going into production to create the new styles. And then you're moving your database back down in order to get that into the lower environments for any work. So this was another good example of where configuration entities could be potentially interesting. So I created another project. This is also out on Drupal.org now as a styles entity. And it's a configuration entity for creating a style library. And styles can be added to content entities. Your styles can be scoped. So we created this concept of uses. So where is this style applicable to? Is this a style that's for a CTA? Is this a style that's for a RTE? If we're going to create a library of 30 or 40 different style variants, you shouldn't have to pick through all of them to style a CTA if that's what you're styling. Just have what's applicable. And in the end, all the style is doing is it's adding one or more classes to the container of the content entity you're referencing it from. So whether that's a paragraph or a node or a block or any other content entity. This also works through an extension of the entity reference field, so that all you're doing is referencing your styles entity on a piece of content, and that's how you bring it into Beam. So here is what we're doing for uses. For this, I wanted to just do something simple. So this is just a simple key value configuration. This gets stored into the default site configuration key value subsystem, and it will get exported as fairly simply YAML configuration. So it's using your conventional key pipe value for a label. Just add as many as you need. This is an example of a styles entity UI. So again, we have our label that has the machine name being generated, so you can tweak that if you want. We can define our classes, so we can have one or more classes, as many as we need to add to the container. And we can pick where we want that style to be able to be used. So in this case, the featured blue class can get added to an RTE or to a call to action component. And when you export this configuration to your file system, you're going to get something that looks a lot like this. It's just a YAML file. It's got all the basic information, the ID of the configuration entity, its label, sequence of whatever classes got added, and an array of where it's going to be used. And this is what the uses stuff looks like in context to creation of a component or wherever you're going to use this. So you end up going into your field UI for whatever content entity you want to add this functionality to. You add a style reference field type to it, and you end up on this page. And down at the bottom, you can choose the reference method, and you'll find the uses method filtered by where the reference entity will be used. And you'll get back a list of any of the uses that have been defined, so you can say, this component is going to only be using the RTE styles. And this is what it ends up looking like for the content editor. So they edit or create their component. They have a little styles drop down. In this case, where we've got chosen applied to it. They click on it. It drops down. They see a list of styles that are only for the component they're styling. In this case, it's a call to action. So the takeaways for this project: styles library can be easily defined using configuration entities. The library can be exported and managed in your code repository and deployed to forward environments. The uses functionality allows us to provide some context to where a style is relevant, improving the user experience for our content editors. By extending entity reference field type, we can provide an easy path for integration. So when this was a custom module for the client, I just knew I was using field underscore styles on all of the paragraphs we were creating. Well, that's not really something you can contribute back to Drupal.org, because you can't just say in your rename, by the way, name your field styles, or it's not going to work. So I extended entity reference field to create the styles entity reference field type. And that makes it easier to iterate through when an entity is being rendered, see if it is using any instances of that field type, and load up the styles and add them to the container. Resources. I have a blog post in the works for JSnippet. I don't have that published yet. I did publish a couple months ago a blog post for the styles entity stuff that you can take a look at. It covers a lot of the same content that we went through just now. You can go out to Drupal.org, projects JSnippet, and find the JSnippet module if you want to take a look at it. The style entity module is similarly under style entity. The release on that page has a bug I found when I was creating my slides yesterday. That is fixed in dev, and I will create a new release. So join us for the Unconference tomorrow. Dan asked me to include this slide. It would be lovely to have all of you here. I'm going to in particular be interested in talking about community in our local user group. So if you have something you want to talk about, make sure to show up tomorrow and we'll discuss. And also rate your sessions. So Dan created a feedback form where you can go and just talk about camp. Tell us what you liked, tell us what you didn't like. We really appreciate that feedback, and it helps us each year to figure out how to shape camp and make sure that we deliver something that's going to be interesting to everybody.